Now, what's your favorite book? What's the go-to book when you have a spare moment? You turn around and you pull a book off your shelf. Which one is it?
That's a great question. I really like Jerry Gunther's. If we're talking about kind of Supreme Court history books, I really liked Jerry Gunther's Learned Hand biography. It came out when I was in law school. It was super influential for me.
Are we on? Ed, are we good? Okay, just to let you know, in the background, it's got Phil Zimmer, let me tell you about Phil Zimmer. He's here because when that article appeared in the Wall Street Journal, positively analyzing democratic justice, it was Phil who said, you need to bring this guy here. And
well, Phil, thank you for doing that.
And as would turn out, we'd already, lined you up to come to talk about Kurt Flood, and so here we are because of Phil. We're talking about this as well. Having read your book the last 2 days, I want you to know that.
You read the book in 2 days?
Yes. Well, I should say I skimmed it. Let me just be more honest about it.
Well, there's a emeritus Harvard professor who read the book pre-publication. He read every word in 3 days and had 10 pages of comments in 72 hours. I don't know how somebody has a human brain that can do that.
I did not. I made notes only for myself, not for you.
No, I hear you. And plus you were skimming it with an eye to all things Robert Jackson. So
there's all kinds of little highlighters of Robert Jackson. But most importantly, Brad, and this is where we want to start, is I want to know where you were on September 6th, 1995. That's just, where were you?
I was in Camden Yards.
Okay, talk about it.
It's funny. Let me start with the present. The Orioles, I grew up an Oriole fan, and I met Cal Ripken when I was 10 at a Washington Bullets basketball game. In the middle of the game, we went up to my father and I went up to get, popcorn, and it was empty. And Ripken was there, and I yelled out his name. And he kneeled down on one knee and told me to be quiet. He went, shh. And he had it was not long after he'd won the MVP. So it must have been like 84 or 85, maybe 84. And he talked to me on one knee. He was so nice. And I was a huge Oriole fan. I grew up a huge Oriole fan. And then I read Roger Kahn's Boys of Summer. And it's just such a beautiful book. It's probably my favorite baseball book that I've ever read. And I just said, I want to do what Roger Kahn did and grow up to cover the team that I grew up watching. And so I did. I turned down all sorts of opportunities to go cover the Orioles after graduation. I had professors saying, I'll write you a recommendation for Oxford or Cambridge. And I'm like, who wants to go to Oxford or Cambridge when I can go to Camden Yards, right? And so I go in 94, and the baseball strike hits. And that's really how this Curt Flood book happened, because I ended up, instead of at the ballpark, at congressional hearings all summer long. I was covering hearings about whether to repeal baseball's antitrust exemption. But in any event, I was for the Ripken 21-31 game. I was in the press box, and most people will have sort of visual moments about being in, at a game. Mine was kind of the temperature. It was so hot inside the ballpark. There were so many people crammed in there beyond capacity, and there were so many people in the press box that I just remember how hot it was, right? I remember all the sights and sounds, but the main thing I remember from that day, right, was the heat. I remember the home run. I remember him making the lap. I remember Palmeiro pushing him out of the dugout. And I liked Rafael Palmeiro very much. He was, on a spectrum of terrible to wonderful. He was more on the wonderful side of the spectrum than terrible. And but I think the most disappointing thing for me was meet, like having my professional relationship with Ripken was not good. And and I'm trying to be kind. He's a wonderful ball player. All the qualities that made him able to do the 21-31, the kind of stubbornness and kind of hard-headedness, and made him really difficult for a print reporter to kind of deal with, on a daily basis. He was really good with the television people, and he was really good with kids, and he has so many great qualities, but he really wasn't good with the print beat reporters. And so the image that I had of Ripken as a kid and the image that I had of him as an adult are totally different. And if you want a window into my images of him as an adult, Richard Ben Kramer wrote a profile that made the cover of Sports Illustrated when there was a bake-off to see who would be the editor-in-chief. And it's a cartoon cover, and Richard very unflatteringly compared Cal Ripken Jr. to the Inner Harbor, not Baltimore's Inner Harbor, not really Baltimore, kind of a fake, because I think one thing that people didn't realize was the sort of public perception of Ripken and the kind of behind the scenes perception were just different. It's not that Ripken was a good guy publicly and a bad guy behind the scenes. He was just a different guy. And I think that was a shock for me as a reporter, that the people that I gravitated to on that team were not Ripken. He wasn't someone I enjoyed talking to, and he was sort of someone I only went up to when I had to. Ripken's good friend Brady Anderson and I were friends, and Jeffrey Hammonds, who Brady played for one of the UC schools, I think it was Irvine, for a couple of years before going into the minor leagues, and Jeffrey Hammonds was the Golden Spikes winner at Stanford, and I think that made a big difference, right, in sort of their interactions with me. They didn't feel threatened by questions. Like every question you gave Ripken, he had to pause, think about the 25 ways that this could be misconstrued, and then give you a nothing answer. In some ways, like I don't know if you saw the Derek Jeter documentary recently. In some ways, his attitude toward the print media was something like Derek Jeter's, which was, I'm not giving you anything, which is fine. He just didn't have the intellectual capability to kind of do it in a different way than he did it. And I just, the baseball clubhouse is not where somebody who's looking for high-minded conversation should be anyway. I was sort of maybe a fish out of water in the clubhouse, but it was fun. I had a great time. Well, you know what I miss, Greg, is I don't miss covering the games. I wasn't really good at the deadline writing, that wasn't my skill set. I really miss the camaraderie in the press box and the kind of game within the game. And I sort of quickly was made to feel like I was part of like a club of people in the press box. Some of the more senior writers, I can drop a few names, but they really liked me for some reason, and kind of took me under their wing and just made me, and let me see all the inside jokes, and that's the kind of thing that I really miss, was that like nightly camaraderie was really fun, and the kind of idea of a baseball season as kind of a soap opera where you really don't know what's going to happen next, and each night there's a kind of or even like a chain novel, right? You don't know what's going to happen next, and it's why baseball is such a great sport, because every night you see something you've never seen before. The other night, watching the game with my wife, I'd never seen an umpire rub a pitcher's ears, right, that were bright red, and I said to her, "Can you believe that this is happening?" And then to see Manny Machado, who it took me a long time to follow the Orioles again after I stopped writing about them, but once I did start following them again, I really followed those Manny Machado Oriole teams. To see Manny Machado making fun of Buck Showalter in the opposing dugout, whom he loves, right? And Buck Showalter's like a father kind of figure to Manny because he came up as a teenager, and they're so close. And to see Manny just teasing him mercilessly for doing that, I got a huge kick out of it. It was really fun. So you can see I still really enjoy the game of baseball and still really enjoy watching. And the game's so different now.
Well, we're going to get into a lot of that tomorrow, and I know that part of what we'll just segue in our conversation tomorrow to get to Kurt Flood will be your intense interest in all things Homestead Grays and Washington Griffith Park and all of that stuff. So I really look forward to it. But were you destined to get into law? Was there a point where you were going to want to be a lawyer?
Yeah, I'll tell you what happened. So when I was new to the paper, they were rotating me for a while. So I was in order to get me in out of college, they made me I was a full-time staff writer, but they designated me a 2-year intern. And so that I was basically on a 2-year probationary period. And they were rotating me. So all summer long, I would do baseball. And then most of the winter, I would go and do cops, like with David Simon from The Wire, who was at the paper.
Yeah.
And that was unbelievable. And my interactions with him were very memorable. I had some trouble with a cop once, and David made one call, and I had everything I needed within 2 minutes. But then they sent me to the Washington Bureau for a time, and I covered a Supreme Court case that I'm going to briefly talk about tomorrow. I'd never been to the Supreme Court, even though I'd grown up in Washington. My parents aren't lawyers. And I covered this case about sports called Brown versus Pro Football Inc. And Ken Starr, who just passed away, was a very nice man, was arguing for the players union. And the lawyer for the NFL is a guy who I've become friends with, Greg Levy at Covington and Burling. And he does 100% of the NFL's outside legal work, and was the runner-up to Roger Goodell to be the commissioner, and would have made a very fine commissioner. But they argued, and I was just, it's just something I'd never seen, but I knew within and Lyle Denniston, who'd been covering the Supreme Court of the United States since 1958, I think 58 or 56, was the Baltimore Sun's Washington Bureau's Supreme Court reporter, and Lyle and I were working on the story together. So I was looking at it from kind of the sports antitrust angle, and Lyle, the kind of seasoned Supreme Court journalist. And it was just, I knew instantly I was totally miscast in a ballpark, right? That I belonged in one of those seats covering the Supreme Court. And that's what I thought I was going to do after law school. That was what my law school application said, was that I was interested in becoming a journalist to cover the Supreme Court. And I still, even well after I was out of law school, considered doing that. But the job I currently have is so much better because I can write about any subject I want. I'm on basically permanent book leave, right? Like all the journalists, have to take unpaid leave to write a book at the Times or at the Post. And I can just figure out whatever topic interests me the most, pursue it, have all my expenses paid by Georgetown Law School in terms of research, and have all these smart, 2Ls and 3Ls, helping me. And it's a dream. And I just really got hooked on the court, right? And hooked on, and I had read Gideon's Trumpet around that time. And that's when I'm just connected to Kurt Flood. I saw Kurt Flood as a Gideon's Trumpet type of story, a kind of one man takes on the establishment story. And that summer of '94, one of my regrets from that summer, I was so new, and I really just wanted to cover baseball, right? I really just wanted the strike to end. But I wish I'd gone to Atlanta to see Kurt get a standing ovation from the players. And I wish I had made a bigger attempt to interview Kurt at the time. And I didn't, even though I wrote about him. But I've kind of figured it, if he wasn't going to talk to David Halberstam for October '64, which he refused to talk to David Halberstam, he wasn't going to talk to me. What's the calculus that I made? But I was still in a regret that I didn't try harder to interview him. It would have been fun.